start off with, I will need you to please state your name as well as your title.
Sure. So my name is Carl Legault. I am a full-time professor at Durham College, mainly teach out of this campus in Pickering in the Addictions and Mental Health program. And I also teach in the Social Service Worker program out of the Oshawa campus. Both programs are pretty interrelated. They overlap a lot in their content, but my main specialization is in addictions and mental health, especially in psychotherapy and treatment.
All right, thank you. So I just wanted to let you know I will be looking at my phone a couple of times just to make sure that I am asking all of the questions and I don't miss out on anything.
Sure.
I mentioned to you that I am doing my assignment on this illustrator, Stephanie Chin, who draws to kind of help her with recover with her addiction to substance abuse. I hope I said it correctly. But so I wanted to know, how can illustrating help Stephanie?
So in a lot of ways, we'll probably come back to this again, but I tend to think not only of people struggling from addiction, but everyone really as doing the best that they can with the tools that they have in the situation they find themselves in life, right? Some of us, unfortunately, start out with some pretty bad tools, right? We didn't get enough from our parents, from our peer groups growing up, or we just got like positively the wrong tools from say like gangs that we were in, or just really bad influences. And we also find ourselves in really nasty situations like bad housing, socioeconomic status, poverty for some people, just really rough. Illustrating can be a way for people, among other things, to process and to express emotions that need to get expressed and that can't be expressed this way. So I'm not one of those people. I'm terrible when it comes to illustrating anything except for like a stick figure, maybe. I'm a musician. I like playing music, but for me, music is a kind of language for emotions. And I've spoken to a lot of visual artists. A lot of my clients have been visual artists, and they've told me that processing and expressing how they feel is only possible for them through their art. And it's a way of reaching really deep into things that words can only superficially convey. Another big reason that illustrating can help is because one of the first things you need to do in recovery is to find a way to healthfully use your time, right? To use your time productively and meaningfully in a way that not only satisfies like your own interests and your basic needs, but that keeps you from being bored. The two biggest predictors of relapse, not to oversimplify things, but people who kind of relapse back to a substance use problem is when they're super stressed or super bored. It's like two ends of the human experience. If you're really bored, you're going to kind of sit there thinking, I've got to do something. I've got to feel something. If illustrating is that one thing that Stephanie can go to, and it's a really healthy way of using her time, I would say that is fantastic. That's a great way of maintaining her recovery without getting lost in activities that could lead her down a path that's really unhealthy and dangerous.
And what about, what's your opinion on her posting motivational illustrations that she creates onto social media?
Yeah, so that's definitely a mixed bag. Potentially lots of good stuff and potentially lots of not so good stuff. It really all depends on how she's engaging with it. Much like substance use itself, it depends on how someone's relating to the substance that they're using. So I'm going to start with the bad stuff, not because I'm negative, but because I like to end on a more positive note. Okay, it sounds like this is really helping her. On the bad side, social media in general is a kind of inauthentic social space. When you think of it, people go on social media and they're not giving you an accurate representation of who they are. It's not like documentary filming. Here's my life, here's me on the couch eating Cheetos, watching season 4 of Friends for the 20th time. People are giving you their home runs, their highlights. It's this carefully curated, polished, like simulacrum of who they are. It's not who they are, right? And that's really sad. As a society, it's a deeper issue that we have to do that to ourselves. Like our digital proxies are not really us. They're versions of us that we're only comfortable sharing to the world. The real us we can't really share. That's a problem already, because who knows, Stephanie might be comparing herself to people within that space who are sharing a version of themselves that is completely unreal. So for example, in her own world of art and illustration, people aren't sharing all of their failed attempts to create something beautiful, right? People aren't sharing all of the really tough moments in their evolution as an artist, they're really sharing the home runs, like the beautiful things they've created. For someone like Stephanie, I would worry that because of its importance in her recovery, being shown only the home runs of other artists could be potentially damaging to her. So that's one thing. The second thing is that social media, again, being this inauthentic space, presents us a world in which non-verbal communication, like non-face-to-face, like the way that we're communicating right now, if I'm saying something and it's provoking a response in you that's, you know, say you're offended or just insulted, or who knows, it's going in a direction that you're just not comfortable with, I can immediately modulate how I'm communicating with you based only on that information, right? And of course, I'm not gonna, laser beam on you and make you even more uncomfortable, but that's one thing of face-to-face communication that is awesome. So if you ask me straight up, hey Carl, how do you think this picture looks like right now? Give me your honest feedback. Face-to-face, I am automatically going to just adjust and modify in a positive direction how I'm going to communicate with you. Online, we know, I'm not just talking about trolls and like the anonymity of the internet. I mean, just well-intentioned people will be more comfortable saying things pretty harshly behind the barrier of a screen. But the digital screen is not good for our communication. Face-to-face communication, not to be too much of an old-timer, but face-to-face communication is one of the only things that allows us to be genuinely gentle with people. We can communicate the same message, but in a far less harsh and destructive way. The final thing I would say that's potentially bad is that it provides an inauthentic social world, right? So one thing that we know about addiction that really helps, I'll come back to this when I say the positives, is that, I'll kind of say this at the same time. So one thing that's great about social media for her and about posting these motivational pieces of art is that it's connecting her to people. Especially it's connecting her to a group of people who are like-minded, who share similar interests, and who derive the same meaning and significance from art that she does, and who are inspired from that art. That's great. Connection's awesome. The problem is that in the digital space of social media, that connection at best is limited, and in reality, it's superficial, right? And it doesn't provide a sufficient stand-in for real life physical contact with people. I don't mean hugging people. I mean being face-to-face with another human being and putting yourself out there in real vulnerability. It's too easy for us to kind of stand beside or stand behind that screen of vulnerability. So going to the positives, the first thing I mentioned is that yes, potentially, as long as she avoids that problem of the superficiality of things, of the harsh criticism and feedback that comes from nonverbal communication, and that carefully curated version of people's lives that create this like impossible standard, as long as she avoids that, she's got connection, and she also has a way of giving back to people. One thing that we notice, not just in addiction recovery, but in mental health, people who are coming out of incarceration, like anyone who has to reintegrate into life, one thing we notice is that to the extent that they're able to give back to a community, like volunteering, there's so much evidence that shows that giving back is a way of giving to yourself. It's amazing what you can do to your own self-esteem, your own self-worth by just helping people who have been in a similar situation as you. So that's awesome. And the final thing is that, again, it's a double-edged sword, right? Or a mixed bag. I don't know what the right metaphor is. Social media can present these digital barriers, but in a way it transcends the barriers of physical space. So you and I, for example, can't realistically meet every day if you live far away from me. Like say, if you lived in, I don't know, Brazil or something, right? Like we just couldn't meet in a coffee shop and I couldn't show you all my artwork, but we can instantaneously exchange that stuff, right? Most of the time just with a Wi-Fi connection, right? And a decent computer and some decent connectivity. And I mean, like once you resolve those logistical issues, we can instantaneously communicate things that are meaningful and transcend the limits of physical space. That is amazing. So that I would say is a huge positive. So again, it's a mixed bag. It's one of those big, it depends answers.
And okay, so what would you say is a good idea for someone to follow a motivational Instagram page such as Stephanie's, and to see them on their feed? Like, is it a good idea?
Yeah, again, I'm hate being that guy that says it depends, but like I was saying, as long as she can avoid a lot of the, or at least mitigate the negative impacts of some of those problems I was mentioning, for example, like just putting yourself out there in a space that has digital barriers that make you more vulnerable to harsh feedback, the kind of feedback you wouldn't get face to face, as long as she's able to recognize and accept the fact that what she's seeing from other people is not their real accurate, kind of, this is me in my full exposed self. It's more that carefully curated, idealized version of themselves. As long as she's able to kind of overcome those issues, I don't see any big problem with her interacting in a limited way, in controlled bursts, in a space where she feels like she's giving back to a community that is probably suffering in a way that's really similar to her. So one thing I would encourage first is limiting her use of these potentially dangerous technologies, right? The other is having good boundaries, right? Good boundaries are fantastic in general, but good boundaries in a digital space are especially important. Especially because once you've transcended the limits of physical space, you can welcome in potentially millions of people into your social world in a moment. I can't do that like this. Like, physically, it's impossible. I just can't get millions of people right here in front of me online. Potentially, I'm not saying it would happen to someone like Stephanie. It's more likely to happen like to a Beyonce, right? To someone who can actually attract millions of people instantaneously. Potentially, she could get millions of people following her, commenting. And just by the law of averages, and about, maybe this is me being a little cynical, I would say that the vast majority of those voices are not going to be perfectly positive and supportive. So learning how to establish the right boundaries and learning how to carefully structure your time and your use of those technologies is a really good place to start. Yeah.
I feel like you answered most of my questions in those few questions that I asked.
That's okay.
Let me just go through and make sure I'm not forgetting anything.
Sure.
Okay, so what else would you recommend to someone who's going through substance abuse? So what recommendations would you give to them?
Okay, so this would fall into three categories. The first I kind of mentioned before, right? Again, this isn't my idea, but the way I frame it is that we are all, especially people in recovery, especially people who struggle with addiction, we're all doing the best we can with what we've got, the tools we have in the situation that we find ourselves in. Now, the tools part is really where my bread and butter is, right? The situation piece, I'll mention in a second, that's more what a social worker can do. That's more what, well, I'll get to that in a second. The tools piece is really just what you can do to manage the pain, the distress, the difficulties in your life, right? So here we're talking about coping skills. We're talking about problem-solving skills. We're talking about making healthy lifestyle changes, right? Just exercise, diet, nutrition. There's this whole arsenal of things. I don't like using that kind of metaphor, but there's this whole type of toolkit that you can bring to your disposal to attack this really monstrous beast that is addiction, because it needs a lot of tools. And honestly, if people are just given the right tools, I would say, again, just throwing a completely meaningless percentage out there, I would say 80% of their battle is done. You give people the right tools, even if they're in a terrible situation, the right tools in the right hands can give someone a huge advantage. The second thing is their situation. So even if someone has the best tools, if they're living in abject poverty, if they have no housing, if they're on the streets, if they're marginally housed, if they're living in a situation of domestic violence, if they're living in a war-torn country, if they're just surrounded every day by just immiserating circumstances where like they can't breathe without being exposed to something stressful. Well, I don't care who you are, no matter how kind of resourceful you are, how many tools you have, that kind of relentless onslaught of suffering, no one can deal with that. Like at some point, you're going to have to improve your life circumstances. Those two things right there, boom, if you can address that, you are already on your way towards a successful recovery. The next thing I would say is kind of more subtle, and I guess it would be more of my spiritual, philosophical approach to this. To me, addiction is largely about people not being able, and this is not a judgmental thing, it's because it applies to me, it applies to you, to everyone. To some extent, we have a hard time being present in our own lives. It's also why we do this so much, right? It's why when I'm sitting down with someone and I have all these people around me, the first thing I want to do is this, because I can't bear to be present in my own life. And for someone who struggles with addiction, the thing that they can't bear to be present with, well, the things, one big thing is emotional pain. Sometimes it's physical pain, but emotional pain, suffering is the big thing. So what I would do in working with someone who's struggling with addiction, and this is why I tend to specialize in what are called mindfulness-based practices, practices that teach you how to be present in your own life and to accept the things that you can't change, is to learn how to confront the things that are causing you pain, to accept the things that you can't change, and when you can change them, to productively and meaningfully work towards changing them. The other things I would recommend for anyone, these are more kind of specific tools, would just be actual clinical formal interventions. We need help, right? Even if you have the best tools, like you read all the right books, you make all the right changes to your life, like you get yourself stable housing, get a good job, you don't have to worry about money as much. Those are all fantastic changes. And you incorporate mindfulness techniques, you can accept your suffering and change it when you can. People need to process their pain formally through psychotherapy. Many people do. Not everyone does. There are some people who can overcome addictions, it's amazing, without having any formal treatment. For a lot of us, we really do need a trained mental health professional to help us work through those issues. And even just to help us build those tools I was talking about. The other thing I strongly recommend is any kind of peer support or formal group therapy. Any situation where you can be in a group of people. This is why when I hear stories like Stephanie's, the first thing I think of is, right, good. Getting connected to a group of people who can be mutually supportive in your suffering and what you're struggling with. In fact, a lot of the evidence shows us that group support can be just as, if not more effective than one-on-one, like highfalutin, sophisticated psychotherapy. That's actually the first thing that I recommend to a lot of people is even if your only support is getting involved in something like a 12-step group, or just getting involved in like a group of 3 to 4 people who meet in a coffee shop just to talk about how crappy life is, or how crappy their recovery is, or how tough it is to be, judged and stigmatized by people. That can be more than enough as a starting point.
All right. So that's all the questions I have for you today. Thank you so much for your time.
Oh, you're welcome.
I appreciate it.
You're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Okay.